Everyone, it's good to have another chance to try and sort my thoughts out, which is what you do for me. I have been exploring some literature I hadn't read for a while and reading some new literature, so it's been a good week for books. And also I listened to Peter Hitchens, the less well-known of the two brothers, give the Scruton Memorial Lecture on YouTube a little while back. I thoroughly recommend it. I even immediately wrote down some of the things. I stopped the YouTube recording to write things down en route. This is the first one I wrote down. We live in a world of which we know very little. We have too few points of hard reference or hard points of reference. We prefer appearances to reality, and we have lost the ability for adversarial discussion. The police have been transformed into social activists, social workers. Those are just some of the comments that turn up in that lecture. And, of course, they're true. What I hadn't thought about, and another book that I'm reading at the moment called The Chosen, not the one from the film, but another one by a guy called Giles Fraser, who was the dean in charge of St. Paul's when the activists started camping out, and eventually that led to his downfall in various ways and his rethinking of what really matters in life, because his sympathy, of course, as who would not be in favour of improving the lot of the poor? No one would surely be against that, although it's pretty obvious that in some cultures where you've been so enculturated with the idea, like the Hindu one, the caste system, that the people at the bottom have got the deserts of what they did in a previous life. That's a very difficult culture to change in that respect. But the one we inhabit is not that one, as is a Judeo-Christian culture. More Christian, and the Judeo bit is getting lost somewhat. And Giles Fraser makes one think about that a bit more. One needs to, because there's one very intriguing feature of Israel. It's the only Western nation, and I include them as Western nations, that has a rising birth rate. They are well over replacement. I think the average in Israel is 4 children per couple, but it's certainly well above the 2.1, whereas all the other cultures in the Western world are only maintaining their population by immigration. That diminishes those hard points of reference that Peter Hitchens is talking about. We need hard points of reference, so hard that we don't even think about them. But it's a recurrent theme in what I do. Medicine is suffering from this too. And this week had one of the most unbelievable phenomena for me. The editor of Science, arguably, well, Nature and Science are the top 2 scientific journals in the world. And the editor of Science was actually said he thought that adjusting the entry into science so that it was more representative of the culture as a whole was more important than competence. That's unbelievable. That's how far the rot has gone. I mean, surely everybody, when it comes to going to their physician, they want the most competent person that they can find. You can see they do, because you go online and you can see who's the best physician in this or that place for whatever subject. But of course, that's done by a Google reductive approach, which isn't what most people are looking for. We used to get to know our doctors. We had a family doctor for life, so to speak. That was the way it was. It wasn't rare for a physician towards the end of his life to deliver a baby and then say, this is the 3rd generation I've delivered in your family. That's the way it was. That's gone now. Yeah, you don't know when you go into the hospital system with the hospitalist rather than your own doctor. You don't see the same person all the while. And yet most of the problems that are turning up within the medical system are in fact primarily the result of disorders of living. They didn't happen when you live in different ways, when there were more connections. So those hard points of reference in Britain came forever from the fact that the Bible was read in school every day. And working class people are anti-intellectual, so they didn't bother about learning. As long as they could read and write, they wanted to make things, do things with their hands on the whole. So, ironically, the bit of school they remember best was the Bible, because they were never tested on it, but they simply heard it every day. And in my school, the headmistress, Miss Davies, amazing, I still remember her name, she had the whole school, every class had to learn a psalm. One day in the year, each of the classes had to recite a psalm in big school, in the main assembly room. Obviously, it was just a verse or so for the first grade, and it went further and further. And I can still remember Miss Crockett, or was it Mrs. Crockett? It would be Miss Crockett here, getting our class to buy into the psalm, "Who shall ascend into the house of the Lord? He that has a clean heart." She wanted some passion from it, and she coached us into doing it. So much so I can still recall that feeling that she managed to get us to jointly have. Very few people have anything like that in school now. Everything happens for a minute or two, and then you move on. That's what the modern media do. So that the hard points of reference in a working class environment was that the Bible says, if the quotation was correct, everybody should, I guess so. They didn't think it was possible to argue against it. They could only go away from it. And, of course, after the end of the old era, when those standards were removed, it's hard to imagine. I wore a tie for school every day in high school. And as a doctor, I wore a tie every day. Pretty well until I went to Jamaica, where, of course, it was too hot to wear ties, so occasionally one wore them there as well. In other words, there were ways of being and doing things that you didn't think about, and that gave you a network of solid foundations. That's a mixed metaphor, if ever there was one. It gave you a solid foundation. All sorts of things you didn't have to think about. You knew what the other person would say, because that's who we were. That's what a culture is, something that tells you who you are and everybody agrees. Now, we don't have that anymore. And the Trotskyites, who believe in continuous revolution, and interestingly, what I learned from Hitchens is one of the first things that Tony Blair did when he became Prime Minister is he made MI5 destroy all the records of people who had been described as left-wing activists in their student life, which included him, of course. So MI5's records of all these Trotskyites, which they knew about, were destroyed, so you can't trace them. And when people like Hitchens, who was one of them, and therefore knows many of them and who they are, when he's gone, it will be much more difficult to recognize what the intellectual heritage of these people is. Starmer, the new Prime Minister, is a Trotskyite, and he doesn't deny it. He hedges. But it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens, because they believe in diversity because it will lead to the power, increased power for a smaller group of people. So their agenda is obviously to diminish the role of law, to diminish the role of Parliament and move to an executive state. That's what Blair wanted. He was envious of the American system, which is vulnerable at that level, as you can see, the way you are ruled not by discussion but by executive order. There's not much difference between that and Marxism, except that there was no way of repealing it when your term came to an end. That still saves you, because the first thing the next president does is basically go through the list of executive orders and cancel them. That gives structure, political structure of a different form than we would get with other systems. We are moving towards an attempt by a relatively small group of people to determine what we think. I mean, you could not have brought in the COVID regulations in the 1950s. The population wouldn't have stood for it. They would have said, we'll decide what we're going to do. Now, some of them would buy into it. And that would have led to the people who were all nervous Nellies hiding away themselves, and fine, they would get the benefit of that. If you have no contact with anybody, you can't catch the disease they carry. But what the people, the politicians, didn't appreciate, and what doctors didn't tell them, although they should have done, is that children are an active immunization program. Your respiratory infection rate goes up tenfold when your children go to school. I used to half-jokingly say to guys with bad lung disease that the best thing you can do is shoot your children because they're the ones who bring infections into your home. That's meant to be. That's the way we are meant to grow. And the kids, by and large, yeah, there are some bad diseases that you get in childhood where the problems are huge. But for children, the COVID populations were minimal, but their lives have been destroyed. You take 2 or 3 years out of the education of children at that critical stage when they're starting to take things in and ask questions, that's been shut down. So you've got a whole generation that have missed a key period of education. And it's not their fault that they have much less interest in the world. They don't travel. The girls are not even getting their driving license, and they're not having sex too. Many of them. There's a lot of noise about sex. The interesting statistics are how many of them are not even getting started on growing up. So they're still teenagers when they get into their 20s and arrive at university. They haven't matured because they haven't had the discussions and been to the places and done the things that they should have done, in part because we've been argued into a kind of nervous Nelly approach to life with our children, helicopter parenting, where parents have their children labelled so they can follow their journey to and from school and everything else like that. None of that used to exist. And of course, the actual risks to children, if you divide the statistics up and remove all the children who come from broken homes and put them in a separate category, the ones that have the privilege of 2 parents who believe in marriage for life, the risk to them has hardly changed because they have a structure to their lives. Now, they don't have quite the structure that we used to have because we've become so mobile and because we live in different ways. And that's sad. I mean, when I was a kid, and I say this quite frequently on this podcast, during the summer, you'd have breakfast and off you'd go, and you come back for lunch and you come back for supper. But the rest of the time we wandered for miles around, climbing trees, doing the vague bits of disobedience that kids of that age do. But that would be reported because our whole area had a fairly stable population, and there were many interconnections, especially between the women, because after the Second World War, a married woman wasn't allowed to have a full-time job because the men coming back from the war had to have work. It upset a lot of them, and with some reason, but it was deemed, and I think rightly, that if you deny men the means to be providers, what do they have left in their lives? The women have the incredible satisfaction of bringing children into the world who change their life for the better, and some of the better of the intellectuals are writing about that now as they realize that their feminism almost robbed them of the best experience in their life, their children. But for the man, his validation comes from providing for and being a stalwart, a foundation of the family. Take that away, we have an entirely different world. I mean, it's not a new discussion. Plato thought that the state should bring up the children. That's what he wanted. Awful thought. But nevertheless, he thought that would be best for the state. We're moving in that direction. Universal daycare and the like. Why not use that money simply to subsidize the family so that mum can take a part-time job, or both mother and father can change their pattern of work while they have children that are dependent? Instead, the state prefers to be in control. It's got too big. So Hitchens is writing about that, and I was delighted to see him give the Scruton Memorial Lecture, because Roger Scruton also understood this. I mean, these two guys both understood what was happening long before most other people did. Scruton was probably the first person to be counselled in Britain, an academic, and instead of getting mad, he went off behind the Iron Curtain and helped to do underground training of intellectuals, so that he's almost considered like a saint in Czechoslovakia, for instance, in the Czech Republic. And they understood that fundamentally, if you're going to flourish as a society, you've got to have common foundations. You can't make a society out of difference. You can only make it out of communality. So bringing people in from entirely different cultures and saying they're all equal, they're all the same, they're interchangeable, is simply not true. But you better be careful as to how you talk about that. I mean, I've been doing it for a long while, and even so, I didn't call it being counselled, but one medical school, I mean, where else would you expect? But the Oregon State Health Sciences Medical School, I actually did a grand rounds for physicians and students, so a good crowd there, and I began the lecture by saying, how many of you here think that multiculturalism is a good idea for medicine and that we should make it fundamental to our training program? And almost every hand went up. I said, well, I think I can prove to you that that's not true, and you don't actually believe that. And all I have to do is to do something that we do in medicine all the while. We start with patients. They raise the question, we have to come up with the answer when we can, and they educate us along the way. So in this particular instance, I said, I just need to give you an example of where multiculturalism was the problem, not the solution. It wasn't on this continent. It was in Africa. But I saw a little girl with a septic knee that had been neglected. And when she got to the hospital, she had bad osteomyelitis in both the tibia and the femur, and she was septicemic and close to death. Now, at that point, the only thing you can do, the knee had been destroyed, was to cut off the leg and get the pus out. And I told the parents that's what would need to happen. And they said, we need to think about it. And my response was, well, the OR will be ready in 20 minutes. But in those 20 minutes, they took her home to die. She wasn't going to survive with that. And I was the only person who was horrified. I'd done rounds to the nurses that morning, and I said, can I talk to you, because I'm disturbed and you're not? And they said, sure. And I said, fortunately, I asked the right question. I said, what would those parents have done if this had been a little boy? And they gave me the answer on a plate. They said, in our culture, they would have saved the boy, because a woman's role in our society is to till the fields, fetch the water, cook the food, and bear the children. A woman with one leg cannot do those things, so she will have a life not worth living. Doesn't that sound modern? It surely does. In my lifetime, we've got to that state. And we're now telling people in hospital and being told that we have to tell them that there comes a point when your life isn't really worth continuing with. And the best thing for you would be assisted death. And we call it MAID in Canada. I don't know what you're going to call it in the US. It's spreading. It'll spread from the West Coast and then to the East Coast. And finally, it'll come all the way across, because a whole culture is being hollowed out. And of course, that was dead silence, because they realized they wouldn't tolerate that at that point. But now we've certainly got students out there who say, well, parents have to decide what in their culture they would do. I mean, they're even having experiments with saying that we should, well, we had an Archbishop of Canterbury mull over the possibility of having Sharia law available in Britain. That changes the culture completely. If you want Sharia law, go and live in a Muslim country. You've come to the West really for economic purposes. They live in ghettos, have no desire to be enculturated. They just want the goodies. Most of them. Hopefully that can change. It does change. I mean, you get people like Nabil Qureshi who converted from Islam and became an incredible evangelist before God decided he should die very young. And he even did that well. So cultures are different. We all have great books which provide these solid foundations. They only go on if they've got such a basis. Now, what the modern world has been capable of, and what our world is now capable of, is a form of government that we've never seen before, because we can be tracked in so many ways with computers, and even more so with artificial intelligence. We can be cancelled. Peter Hitchens refers to a guy who upset the government in Britain, and they have made his life impossible. He hasn't been charged or taken to court, but he can't get a job. He can't access his own funds. They can do that. In the truckers thing in Canada, the worst thing that they did was they took away the access to money of the truckers. They told the banks to cancel their credit cards, to cancel their credit. That's such a major step. They had no right to do that without. That's a reason for a general election. But they didn't. Now, of course, what they're trying to do is pretend the whole thing never happened. Hopefully we'll have enough smart people to keep it alive until they're really... There's been no apologies. The same has been true in Britain. And I'm sure it's true in America. I don't know any specific examples of people who have been wrongly got at by the PC people, punished, cancelled. I don't know them personally, but plenty of people have been cancelled. So people look over their shoulder now, where previously you could say what you wanted to, and people could say, well, I think you're absolutely bonkers, you got it wrong. But you have the right to say what you want. It was Voltaire who said, I totally disagree with you, but I would give my right arm to defend your right to say it. In fact, I think he probably said, I would give my life. It's me trying to pull back a quotation. You can find it easily enough. It's a famous saying, but it's not true anymore. We have a huge battle over the question of freedom of speech, and it's not small. You've got a small window in the States with the current Supreme Court who might force some discussion, serious discussion about these things. Churches should be discussing them, but when did you hear a discussion about freedom of speech? In church, I don't think I've heard one. But we certainly want the freedom to preach. But you notice that Hillary et al., they changed the way of talking. They didn't talk about religious freedom. They talked about freedom of worship. That's very subtle and very clever. You don't worship on the streets, you worship in the church. What they were wanting to move towards is to say you can't preach, you can't spread your gospel outside the church. They spread theirs all the while through the media and the like, based on the idea that we don't need God, no transcendence is required. You can see what it does, how it empties the world, flattens it out. Read Solzhenitsyn's great commencement address at Harvard, which they hated, but he was absolutely right. Going to Russia, which I did first of all in the 60s behind the Iron Curtain. In my case, I didn't get to Russia till later. I just went to the Czech Republic first, but it was such a grey environment because everybody had to think whether what they were saying would be not acceptable to the government. And there might be people, well, there were people there who were stitches. Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany was an incredible place for having people looking over everybody's shoulders. When the wall came down and they went for the records, people were appalled by how much detail there was about their lives. There was no privacy. We know already, you only have to look at the advertising you get sent to you without you asking for it. Somebody somewhere is running an algorithm, and it put your data in place, and up you popped. And so they send you stuff you don't want, but it's often close to your areas of interest. In fact, with films and books and things like that, they say here are some other titles that you might enjoy. It's got good aspects. It's efficient, but there are always people who will manipulate it for bad reasons. The scamming of ignorant people and elderly people is wicked, and it's big time. Without computer access, it wouldn't happen. These are not simple things to deal with. So Peter Hitchens' The Abolition of Britain, published over 25 years ago and still in print, is worth reading. Good prose and even better argument. Just read one or two of in this edition, the people who wrote reviews. Some passages are almost laughable in their old foginess, while others are just plain offensive. He even puts in the bad ones. He says, here's another one. He thunders against all that is politically correct, modish and permissive. This is an English nationalist lament, a cri de coeur against the forces of global standardization that are eating away at all we hold dear. Another, he is full of genuine concern about the world he monitors and has an admirable contempt for the manner in which many modern social contrivances, such as political correctness, are employed. Many of the points he makes are valid, and many of his targets thoroughly deserve it. Another, Hitchens can write. I share Hitchens' bafflement with Mr. Blair and his crushing of the Tories. Another one, when I'd finished this book, I thought I'd better have a cold shower. Books like that don't come up too often to get that kind of response. And his agent took forever to find a publisher. Most wouldn't publish it. This is a much more frequent phenomenon now. Jeffrey Satinover, who wrote one of the best books on homosexuality and the Politics of Truth, told me that he wrote it because he was one of his friends died of AIDS at the beginning, and he discovered that what was going on was simply not honest. So he wrote an academic book, footnoted, referenced, a very smart man. He eventually took a break and did a PhD in physics for relaxation. He sent it to all the mainline presses, and he got polite refusals. They said, this is a very good book, but we can't possibly publish it. That's the power of the unions. And pride power now is much greater than that. And they're not satisfied with what they've got. They want more. In the end, it was published by Baker, a little evangelical press in the prairies, and they got a bestseller as a result. And they deserve it, because he simply insists on telling the truth. And we haven't been telling the truth. And we've paid now. We've got to our usual problem. We come up with a technological solution to a moral problem. When I went to Africa for the first time in the late 80s, right at the beginning of the HIV phenomenon, and of course it began in Central Africa, the place to which I went. At the end of that first trip, I added a trip to South Africa, because I'd got to know the professor of pediatrics at Witwatersrand, the best medical school one of the best medical schools in South Africa. And they were being cancelled by the rest of the world, so that the academic world, which is always stupid in this direction, was not going to South Africa. There was a ban on it. And so he said, would you come? I said, if you can get me permission, yeah, sure I will. And he said, I think I can manage that, because you'll be lecturing on malnutrition, and only black children get malnourished. And I'm well known to the ANC as doing a lot of work in that area. As well as being at Witwatersrand, I go to Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto regularly every week. And so he got me permission to go. And off I went. One of the things I did was give a lecture on the treatment of malnutrition at Baragwanath in Soweto. And after the lecture, There were some questions about the lecture, but then one guy said, look, you just come from Central Africa. We've just got our first case of this new disease. Have you seen much of it? I said, yeah, quite a bit. So we exchanged views and talked about it. Now, who would have believed that you could go from that state till some, I suppose 10 years later, something like that. I was in South Africa at Christmas time and staying with a paediatrician in Bloemfontein, a very conservative area of socially conservative area of South Africa. She said, will you do grounds with me on Boxing Day? Because I'm on call. My residents would enjoy meeting you. So I said, sure. And we went off to the hospital. The first child we saw had been brought in by great-grandmother. Grandmother had died of AIDS, and mother was too sick to bring her in with AIDS. That happened in 20 years, or less, 10 years. We went from first case to having a significant number of students in the dominantly black medical school who were not going to make it to being a doctor because they were HIV positive. And every young physician was writing death certificates on people his own age during his training very frequently. You don't go into medicine to do that. It needs a certain type of mental and moral strength to be able to cope with it. And of course the truth could not be spoken. The UN head for this area was a Canadian, Lewis, who just went round preaching condoms. He was intelligent enough to know that that could not possibly be the solution. Condoms have a failure rate even under ideal circumstances. And when you're drunk and disorderly, the failure rate is much higher. It might slow the rate down, but it'll probably increase the total number of cases over time. The only proper advice at that time would be, we don't have a cure for this disease. It's transmitted by sexual activity. The only absolutely safe advice we can give you is that marry a virgin and be a virgin yourself. Then you cannot get it. But that was not said. And then we got treatment, so now they can carry on in a happy way and take one pill a day, and they're okay in most cases. Not totally. There are consequences. There always are. So I don't know quite how this talk got to this point, but I think the bottom line would be, everything has consequences in our world. Our world is consequential, not just physically. Everybody knows that the law of gravity says that if you jump off a skyscraper, you'll be going so fast when you hit the ground that you're dead. That's physical consequence. But moral consequence is that what you do is what you become. If you use lies to avoid reality, you will become a liar, and that's a punishment. And it applies across the board. It's rather a sad ending for the day, except, of course, our good Lord said that he gave us the 10 Commandments as a starting foundation, and he added this: if you will keep these laws, it will go well with you and your children forever. He gave us a foundation which we're now eroding. Read Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind, and he's an atheist, an unbelieving Jew, a radical homosexual who I believe died of AIDS in the end. I'm not sure about that. But he understood. And the first chapter of that book is worth reading several times. So, have a thoughtful week.